All right, now we'll look at what we call absolute and comparative advantage. So absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Absolute advantage basically means you're able to produce more We'll put that in another country. Alright, so when you have an absolute advantage, I can produce more than another country, right? So for example, if the United States can produce more oranges than Argentina, right, then we would have an absolute advantage there, right? Now, when we talk about trade, what's really important is having a comparative advantage. And here we mean being able to produce at a lower opportunity cost. All right, excellent. Right, this is what we mean by absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Looking at this, what we'll do is we'll start saying to ourselves, well, here let's assume we have two countries, right, and they only produce two goods. They either produce wheat or they produce wine. Okay, and we'll say Chile, if they focus all their resources on producing wine, they could produce 60 units of wine, or they can produce 60 units of wheat. While in the United States, they can produce either 120 units of wheat or 80 units of wine. And we'll assume that they're initially consuming, the US is consuming 90 units of wheat and 20 units of wine, while Chile initially is consuming 30 and 30. Okay, who has an, first of all, absolute advantage? The US has an absolute advantage in both goods. Notice, the United States can produce more wheat than Chile can, and they can produce more wine. So in both of these goods, the United States has a absolute advantage. But when it comes to trade, it's not absolute advantage that matters. It's what we call comparative advantage. Comparative advantage just basically means you're able to produce at a lower opportunity cost. All right? So what we need to do is find what the opportunity cost is here, right? So for US, what is the opportunity cost for them producing? We'll put US here, we'll put wheat and wine, right? What is their opportunity cost? All right, so to produce, for the US to produce 1 unit of wheat, right, how many units of wine would they be losing out on? Right, in order to figure this out, all you're going to do is divide these two endpoints, okay? And whatever number is in the denominator is what you want to find the opportunity cost for. So in this situation, you'll do 80 divided by 120. This is 8 over 12. Here you're left with 2/3, right? So for every 1 unit of wheat I produce, I lose out on 2/3 of a unit of wine. Okay? And then for wine, I'm going to do just the opposite. It's going to be 120 over 80. Whatever number is in the denominator is what I want to find the opportunity cost for. Okay? So this ends up being 3 over 2. So for every 1 unit of wine I produce, I lose out on 3 over 2 units of wheat. Okay, let's do the same thing with Canada. With Canada, it's a little bit easier because these endpoints are the same. So the opportunity cost for wheat is just going to be 60 over 60, which is 1. And for wine, it's going to also be 60 over 60, which is equal to 1. Right? Here we have 1 unit of wine and 1 unit of wheat. Remember, for every 1 unit of wheat we produce, we lose out on 1 unit of wine. For every 1 unit of wine I produce, I lose out on 1 unit of wheat. Okay? All right, good. Now, once we know this, all we're going to do is compare. Well, who has the lower opportunity cost when it comes to producing wheat? Okay? And it's clear to see that the United States has a lower opportunity cost when it comes to producing wheat. Right? For every 1 unit of wheat they produce, they would lose out on 2/3 of a unit of wine, while Canada loses out on a whole unit. 2/3 is less than 1, so U.S. has the comparative advantage when it comes to producing wheat. So we'll circle that over here for the U.S. For Canada, they have a comparative advantage when it comes to producing wine. Why? For every 1 unit of wine they produce, they lose out on 1 unit of wheat, while the United States loses out on 3/2 units of wheat, which is greater than 1. Okay, so good. Why do I say that? Like, when it comes to trade, comparative advantage is more important than absolute advantage. Well, let's take a look here. Right, what we're going to do is we'll say here that initially, again, we have the US here and Canada. All right, and we have what? Wheat, and we have wine. And we'll say initially that US is consuming this amount, and Chile, sorry, not Canada, Chile. Why did I put Canada here? Chile is consuming this amount right over here. So initially, Chile is consuming 30 and 30, while the US is consuming 90 and 20. Right? It seems like they don't really need each other, right? Or really the United States doesn't need Chile. All right, but how could they both benefit here? Well, what they can do is, instead of trying to produce both of these goods, they'll do what we call specialization, right? When we have specialization, then we'll say that each country will focus on what they have a comparative advantage in. Okay, so Chile, we said, has a comparative advantage in making wine, while the United States has a comparative advantage in making wheat, right? So good, they're going to focus on making wheat, while Chile focuses on making wine, right? So here's, again, both of these countries are specializing, right? They're only focusing on one thing. Okay, excellent. All right, now what we're going to do is now we're going to trade. Now, the main idea is that you can get up to this part right over here, right? You're able to identify what's the opportunity cost for each country producing 1 unit of this good, and then you're able to see which country has a comparative advantage, and then what it would look like when each of them specialize. Then basically they could trade. Now, the combinations of trade vary, but I'll just make up a trade here where both countries would be better off. Okay? All right, so what we'll say is that the United States, they'll send 30 bottles of wine over to Chile. Okay? And Chile will send them over, maybe we'll say, I don't know, how about 25 bottles of wine? Okay, so United States sends 30 units of wheat to Chile, and then Chile sends 25 units of wheat to the United States. Okay, now notice here, right, I want you to compare this right here with this original bundle right over here, right? And I want you to notice that after trade, notice how both countries are better off. Notice the United States is now consuming 5 more units of wine, and Chile is also consuming 5 more units of wine. Okay, good. These are the benefits of trade.